Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather. On today's episode, we're telling the story of Lucas Leonard, who was beat to death during a counseling session at his church, the Word of Life Church in Chadwick County, New York. This episode is so upsetting because, one, Lucas was just a kid, and this also happened in a place of worship. His family thought they were honoring the church, which you'll see is actually run more like a cult. And I sort of fell down a bit of a rabbit hole with this case. So we're going to talk about the whole story, a lot about the church, the families, and lastly, the incident. It's a long one, so get comfortable. I also did break everything down into chapters as well. So if you want to skip ahead, you can in the comments. Just click where you want to go. But I do recommend listening to the whole thing because it just sort of makes more sense when you know the whole story. Let's jump in. Lucas Leonard and his brother Christopher Leonard were the sons of Bruce Leonard and Deborah Leonard. Bruce and Deborah had both been previously married and had kids with their previous partners. But when those relationships ended, they were both kind of lost. Deborah's ex was said to be quite emotionally abusive, and Bruce had some ugly custody issues with his ex. So both became a bit depressed and found that leaning into their faith really helped them get through those hard times. Deborah's brother Rick suggested that she try out a small local church that he was involved in. Deborah would join Rick to visit Pastor Jerry Irwin and attend his sermons, which were hosted in Jerry's basement. I guess it was in sort of a living room area. The sermons were usually a small group of people, mostly family and some friends, but Debbie found that she really liked Pastor Jerry and how direct he was in his teachings. A few years later, Bruce also started to attend Pastor Jerry Irwin's sermons as well. He was brought by a family friend who thought maybe a new church would help get Bruce out of his depression. You see, Bruce had stopped going to his previous church because it just didn't feel the same without his wife and his daughter by his side. This is where Bruce and Debbie would meet, at Jerry Irwin's basement sermons. The two stayed friends for a few years, but they'd start dating and eventually they'd get married. They were both very loyal to Jerry Irwin. They both found salvation in church after their messy divorces. So to them, being true to God and Pastor Jerry was very important to them. They truly believed Jerry could speak directly to God and that God could give them messages directly through Pastor Jerry. Knowing that Jerry could talk to God meant that he was their only true link to God's word. After Bruce and Deborah got married, they lived on Main Street, not far from the church. It was said to be a small, old blue house that was built in the 1900s and bought by them in 1993 for just $28,000. It wasn't well kept, though. The house was always disheveled inside and out. Dishes were always dirty, dinner was always late, laundry was always all over the house. The kids didn't really have bedtimes and often would just sleep wherever they passed out for the night. However, the kids always seemed to be clean, and cleanliness is next to godliness. Lucas would be born on November 8th, 1995, and Christopher was born in 2000. Then they had Grace, and lastly, another child whose name has been withheld. Kristen, Bruce's daughter from his previous marriage, would make the church her home for a little while, and she too was very loyal to Pastor Jerry. Lucas was known to be a very happy-go-lucky kid. He usually just rode his bike, hung out in the front yard, and he was pretty quiet, but also very smart. He liked to tinker with things and build stuff out of nothing, like a hoverboard, or taking things apart to try and figure out how they worked. Christopher was even quieter than Lucas, but also super smart as well, but also super caring, always putting others' needs before his, and nobody in the neighborhood had anything negative to say about the boys. Sarah Ferguson, Deborah's oldest daughter, didn't always stay at church, but typically when people left the church, they were shunned, but not Sarah. She was able to come and go as long as she returned to worship at the church. At 19, she worked as a flight attendant, but was fired due to a drinking problem. She then worked various jobs all over the country and met her first love. Sorry, I don't have his name. They had plans to move to Florida, but while her boyfriend was finding an apartment, Sarah secretly started dating another man. They'd break up, but eventually rekindle their relationship. Sarah, however, was pregnant with this other man's child. But they got married anyway, and Sarah and her now husband had a child of their own 2 years later. Now, throughout their marriage, her husband never liked the church, and he would stop attending services because he was disgusted with how the Irwins treated people like the Leonards. After about a year of skipping service, Sarah gave him an ultimatum: pay 10% of his wages to the church or divorce. He chose divorce. Sarah would then get pregnant with another man's child while trying to attend college, but dropped out as the baby was being born because it just got too hard. She then had a fourth child, and when her fourth child was only about 2 months old, she moved into the attic of the Leonards' home. So by the age of 31, she had 4 kids and moved back home as a single mom. The kids were quiet and generally happy, as were Lucas and his brother Christopher. The Leonards definitely never beat or really yelled at anyone. It was, according to Pastor Tiffany Irwin from the Word of Life Church, that there was rebellion in the Leonard home. The Word of Life Christian Church was founded by Jerry and Tracy Irwin in Otesco in 1987. They're the parents of Joseph, Dan, and Tiffany Irwin, who later was basically running the church. Jerry claimed that he grew up in an abusive home. His parents would call him stupid and that he'd never amount to anything. His father hit him on multiple occasions, so when he was 16, he left home with hatred for his parents. Jerry would work many different jobs, get married, and have 2 kids. That marriage ended, and his ex ended up taking the kids and moving far, far away. And from what I gathered, Jerry seemed jealous, insecure, and was often paranoid. For example, he thought that his ex had someone spying on him at one point. It said his ex thought that Jerry was insane. He allegedly would talk to demons, paint weird stuff on the walls, and was very verbally abusive. So she left because she feared him. Jerry would then meet Tracy. Tracy grew up on a farm and tended to the animals and was said to be very sheltered and gullible. She was also raised Christian and was very active in her church. Jerry and Tracy had met on a farm where Tracy was helping out to deliver a cow. And they never actually dated. Instead, they become pen pals. And in one letter, Jerry would write that God told him that he would be married to Tracy. They then married only 2 months after meeting. And Jerry started his basement church on their wedding day. Jerry eventually moved his sermons from his basement to the old junior high school in Chadwicks, New York. And at first, the sermons were held in the former economics room, but the building was shared with other businesses. Back then, people would say that Jerry was kind, caring, and a really loving person. His church was open to the public, and it slowly started to grow. But within the next few years, Jerry would change. Jerry started belittling his members, calling them names, and had a really bad temper. People started to fear him, but they stayed with the church because they thought it was their pathway to heaven and the only way to get God's message. Remember, Jerry could speak to God. But in 1990, Jerry left. He went to Rochester, New York to pastor with the Deliverance Movement, which was basically a group of traveling ministers who would help ill people that were possessed by demons. They performed cleansing rituals, which could be compared to what you'd see in The Exorcist, where someone would wither and scream while a holy person would pray and speak in tongues. Apparently, Jerry could speak in tongues. While Jerry was gone doing this other work, Deborah's brother Rick became the pastor and took over the sermons. And things were amazing during this time. The congregates would socialize, have pizza parties, and gather happily. Unfortunately, by 1993, Jerry was kicked out of the church in Rochester and he'd moved back to Chadwicks. Now that Jerry was back, he would start to control and oversee everything. He opened a school in the church where the kids could go from kindergarten all the way up to grade 12 because public school was demonic. Debbie Leonard, Lucas's mom, also became a teacher there. Jerry also facilitated the purchase of the entire building with $175,000 in church contributions, and then changed the name to the Word of Life Church, which is not tied to the Word of Life Christian Church. Jerry's church was non-denominational. They also didn't celebrate any holidays. Halloween was especially creepy for the neighbors, and it said that men in trench coats would hide in the bushes to chase kids off the lawn, and they would patrol the roof guarding the building. To the Word of Life Church, Halloween was demonic, and they wanted no part of it. When the church first took over the building, the community was really welcoming to the idea of a church. And why wouldn't they? Church is generally wholesome and safe, but it didn't take long before they realized that this church was different. A large locking gate was installed, and nobody went onto the property unless you were part of the church. So it was no longer open to the public. The neighbors really didn't see people coming or going much, and when they did, it was mostly in the middle of the night. Nobody really saw or spoke to the congregates. Sometimes people would see children roaming around outside, but for the most part, the women and children were always indoors and not allowed to speak with anyone. Eventually, the only sounds they heard on a regular basis were dogs barking, usually coming from the roof or a deck near the side of the building. A neighbor once called animal control for the non-stop barking and learned that the Irwins were not only pastors, but also ran a dog breeding business. Well, a puppy mill, actually. There were rooms full of dogs and dozens of birds. When it was time to sell a dog, they would actually drive it outside the gate and meet the purchaser on the street. A neighbor in an apartment called authorities about the puppy mill, and strangely, not long after the report, a giant billboard was erected, angled towards their apartment saying, "Jesus saves." Evidently, they were also selling exotic birds out of the church. To help pay for things, Jerry also started to put out bylaws within the church, forcing members to give 10% of their paychecks to the church. If you worked within the church, you didn't get paid anything, as that was seen as working for God. Jerry also did not want anyone speaking, let alone gathering, so no more pizza parties. That is not an exaggeration. Members were not allowed to talk to each other at all. Tiffany also took this very seriously and enforced this law with an iron fist. If she saw anyone talking, even her own mother, she would get angry and tell them off. It got so bad that even family members were not allowed to talk to each other. Talking was a distraction, and people were meant to be praying or working for God. Marriages were also another thing Jerry tried to control. He would use the word of God to break up marriages and arrange others. On one occasion, he had a teenager from the church call a lawyer to assist her in facilitating a divorce for a married couple who had kids. And then Jerry had the teenager marry the divorced man whose marriage was dissolved by said teenager. So here is this teenager now married with 3 new stepchildren, all by the hands of Jerry Irwin through his messages from God. These messages from God would be Jerry's mind control. Jerry wanted to believe that they'd be damned if they didn't follow his rules. Heaven forbid if they left, because the Word of Life Church was really the only real church in the world. If anyone did leave, rumors would swirl of all the sins that these traitors have done and how they were possessed by demons. One member said that after he and his family left, he heard that Jerry spoke at Sunday service saying that this ex-member had been seen French kissing his cousin. I read on a cult education website that one of Pastor Tiffany Irwin's sermons covered topics like rebellion, demons, spirits, witchcraft, molestations, and visions from God, which coincidentally would be the same issues brought forward during the murder trial later on. But by Tiffany's definition, molestation could be as innocent as looking at someone of the opposite sex. Hugging, holding hands, any type of touching was molestation. Even little kids weren't allowed to roughhouse. Everything was sexualized and considered a sin. Jerry would also tell the congregates that they couldn't trust police and couldn't trust firemen. God was the only one to trust, and God could speak to him or his daughter Tiffany. In May of 2012, Jerry had a massive stroke. His daughter Tiffany found him, but wouldn't call 911 unless she got direction from above. No sign was received, so Tracy, Jerry's wife, would bring him to the third-floor apartment and look after him there. He never received any medical treatment, but she would use natural remedies like feeding him cayenne pepper. Tracy also spent $30,000 on a soft-shelled hyperbaric chamber. It wouldn't be until about 6 months later before she would drive to Indiana for medical attention. So Tracy, her brothers, and Jerry, of course, got a room at Varsity Clubs of America, which had a heated pool, hot tubs, mini golf, pool tables, and a lot of other luxuries. And they stayed here for 6 weeks for Jerry's supposed medical appointments. And it's not said why Tracy's brothers needed to go, but they spent most of their time in gun stores. And they actually had a makeshift firing range under the church and would vow to defend the church with whatever force necessary. On December 8th, Tracy called home saying that Jerry had died and they needed to resurrect him. So Tracy drove Jerry's body across state lines, which is illegal, to Missouri so she could ask TV minister Mel Bond to bring Jerry back to life. At 9:30 p.m., Tracy then called home again saying that Jerry was alive. And everyone at the church was very happy and knew it was their prayers that were answered. And for the record, Mel Bond did not assist in a resurrection. And when Tracy showed up, they promptly were asked to leave. Jerry was in fact not alive. Tracy would then take Jerry back to the hotel and finally call the coroners to collect the body. She would also call home again and claim that Jerry spoke to her in a dream, informing her that a resurrection would mean a diminished life. So it was Tracy who decided to let him go to God. Their daughter, Pastor Tiffany Irwin, would take over and continue with her father's aggressive teachings. But before Jerry passed away, he made sure to let the members know that Tiffany too could speak with God, and she was their pathway to salvation. Tiffany, from birth, was always groomed to be the next pastor. By age 11, she was reading the Bible for 2 hours a day, leading prayer at breakfast. She was always studying the Bible. Tiffany had other siblings, but it was her who was the chosen one. Tiffany would soon blare her teachings on the speakers throughout the building 24/7. It would play on a continuous loop until the next sermon was recorded. The Leonards, Lucas's parents, were very much brainwashed by the church and the Irwins. They would do just about anything for them who promised a path towards heaven. But the Irwins didn't really like the Leonards and thought they were full of evil spirits and witchcraft. It was partly because they couldn't afford to donate a lot of money, but also because in their eyes, they didn't discipline their kids enough and they allowed TV. Pastor Tiffany would always shame them during sermons, mostly for their home life and basically the filth and disarray of their home. Now, remember how Sarah moved back in with the Leonards with her 4 children? This is really when things started to fall apart. Sarah would move Grace, Lucas and Chris's younger sister, into the attic apartment with her, claiming that the boys were molesting her. They would push furniture against the door, put padlocks on both the inside and outside of the door. They ate their meals in the attic and really only left to get bottled water or use the bathroom. The floor was basically just covered in mattresses, clothes were piled waist high in the corners, food was left out in pots and pans, and Sarah's children were basically being held captive in this space, all because Sarah thought her brothers were evil. During this time, Tiffany was showing the same erratic behavior as her father once did. She would think that everyone was an enemy. She would see demons inside people through their eyes, and she often heard voices. For some reason, she also feared that she'd be raped or kidnapped and saw men to be predators and molesters. At one point, Tiffany claimed that Lucas was demon-possessed, and he was trying to get into her dreams with witchcraft. These dreams were always sexual in nature, and she would write in her journals that she would stop sleeping so that she couldn't sin with him in her dreams. Lucas had started smoking and reading books that weren't the Bible, which meant that he was rebelling. This would upset Sarah, and whenever Lucas would leave the house, Sarah would try and rid his bedroom of evil spirits and demons, but it wasn't working. Sarah was also consistently texting Tiffany, giving her a play-by-play of what was happening in the home. And this only fueled the hatred that Tiffany already had for Lucas and his brother. She was now convinced they were involved with child abuse towards their nieces and of witchcraft. April of 2014, Luke was having some pain in his knee, and he would get a scan by the doctor which showed an anomaly, which could have been nothing, but could also have been cancer. And Luke never informed Tiffany of this, and this infuriated her. She felt slighted and told Luke she prophesized his cancer, so the Leonards needed her for prayer and a treatment plan. Luke then decided to start obeying, or at least pretend to obey. He apologized for not consulting Tiffany with his cancer treatment, agreeing with everything Tiffany was saying. Yes, I lied. Yes, I was sinful. Yes, yes, yes. And he promised to do better and repent. But then Luke made the decision to go to church with his other stepsister, Crystal, who had left the World of Life church years earlier and was estranged by Bruce and Debbie. When Luke attended a different church, all hell broke loose. Apparently, Debbie was informed that Luke was not ready to repent. Sarah lost her mind and would text Tiffany of this discovery. And coincidentally, 4 years earlier, Tiffany had wrote in her journal that one of her biggest fears was that the Leonard children would grow up and want to leave the church. So this was now coming to fruition. If the boys left, what's stopping other people from leaving? People were not allowed to leave the church. Her response was that the Leonards needed to be punished. They needed to be fixed. So after Sunday service on October 11th, 2015, Pastor Tiffany called the Leonard family in to confront Lucas and his brother Chris, along with other parishioners. It said that the boys needed to participate in an overnight counseling session in the church. Now, I don't know if the plan all along was to beat them, but the brothers were brought in to forsake their sins. Apparently, Lucas and Christopher needed to understand that the child abuse and witchcraft was causing pain to others, which I should point out was never actually proven. The counseling session would start off with Tiffany questioning Lucas and Christopher about their use of witchcraft, plotting their parents' murder, and abusing their sister Grace and their nieces. The questions would be answered with the boys admitting to these sins. They were told that if they admitted to their sins, they could leave. So it could also be said that they admitted to these sins so that they could just get kicked out of the church. Unfortunately, by admitting to these sins, it just angered everybody, and everybody was believing it. Linda Morey, a loyalist of the church, would be the first to slap Lucas in the face, as she was appalled by their confessions. Then Joe Irwin, Tiffany's brother, would punch as hard as he could 3 times in Chris's stomach. Linda would take turns punching Chris, as did Chris's own mother, Debbie. The attention would also turn to Luke, and the group started to circle the boys, screaming questions at them about molesting their family. Joe would finally punch Luke in the stomach, followed by a kick to the gut. Disciple Dave, Linda Morey's son, would grab Luke and hold him up so Joe could give him more punches. And Joe's hands would swell from the beatings. It said at one point that Sarah did suggest calling the police on Luke and Chris for the molesting of her kids, but Linda's husband was actually a correctional officer. So they thought they knew what happened to child molesters in jail, so decided against it, even though they were basically doing the same thing. Even during the peak of the beatings, the boys continued to admit everything. They kept being told that if they admitted their sins, the beatings would stop, but the beatings never stopped. It would then be Linda who grabbed an electrical cord and handed it to Bruce, who used this as a weapon against Luke. Debbie was handed the cord as well, striking both boys. Disciple Dave would then beat Luke, and finally Sarah would take the extension cord and start furiously whipping Luke below the belt for revenge on what they did to her children. She did this so much that he would start bleeding from a laceration on his penis. This would go on for upwards of 13 hours. By the early morning, everyone was tired. The boys were so hurt that they could barely speak or even stay awake. And the group of attackers were tired too, so they'd start dispersing around to various areas of the church to sleep. Dave would bring ice for Luke's privates, but the damage was done and it really didn't help. After 8 a.m., Luke had slid off the chair he was sitting on and was soiling the rug with his blood, withering in pain. Dave and Joe would then put Luke on a tarp to minimize the staining, and then Joe texted his mom, Tracy, asking for a sandwich and the steam cleaner. Then, just before noon, Tracy had shouted for Debbie and Bruce to come quick. Something was wrong with Luke. Tracy, who was not part of the counseling session, rushed in to find Luke not breathing. She tried to perform CPR while Bruce paced around, pondering for a while whether or not Luke needed to go to the hospital. By the time Luke got to the hospital, he was already dead. When questioned, Bruce simply said, "I think he got beat up last night." Bruce and Debbie weren't forthcoming with information to hospital staff or police, and their answers were really vague in what happened to Luke, because they wanted to protect the church. Chris would also eventually be looked at by doctors, and he was actually dying. He had internal bleeding, major kidney damage, air outside of his lungs, and he would end up staying in the hospital for a week for treatment. Despite Bruce and Debbie keeping their mouths shut to protect the church, the police were lucky because they had an astronomical amount of evidence. They were able to obtain search warrants of the entire church, cell phones from everyone involved as well. There were hundreds of text messages, photos, emails, audio recordings, and Tiffany recorded everything in that church as well. She also wrote a very detailed journal, and she started writing a journal from a very young age. On trial, Sarah Ferguson would say that she believed that there were demons hiding inside her brothers. She would also beat her brothers' genitals to punish them for abusing her daughters. Sarah also testified that Lucas and Christopher used a crowbar to get into the attic apartment to rape her kids, while Sarah and Grace were sleeping. Somehow, they didn't wake up when this happened. The boys also somehow didn't leave damage to the padlocks, as they were always intact as well, which is, I think, where the witchcraft came in. It can be assumed that Tiffany used her control to put these thoughts into Sarah's head. I mean, she could speak to God, remember? So if Tiffany said something happened, then it probably did. When I watched Sarah on the stand, I noticed that she got very mad and upset when describing the whole ordeal. Not because she felt bad, but because she still believed that Luke actually molested her kids. And I could see why she got mad if it were true, but there was no proof or evidence that the abuse even happened. In fact, the doctor that examined the children said that there was no signs of sexual abuse. There was, however, bruises. The child who had bruises said that she was disciplined by her mother with a paint stick. Sarah would pull her pants down and hit her bottom, and the bruises were consistent with a paint stick. The only thing that the kids could recall was that they were teased or maybe tickled for fun and games. None of them admitted to being touched inappropriately. Sarah also testified and had similar claims about believing that the boys did the things that they claimed to do. Christopher testified in court that he did in fact inappropriately touch Sarah's children, but denied raping them. He couldn't really convey or put into words what exactly he did though, just that it was inappropriate. Now remember, the church did sort of change what the word molest meant. So a bear hug or wrestling or holding hands would often be seen as abuse or lustful acts. So it's not really convincing that Christopher actually did anything wrong. He's probably just as brainwashed as his parents. When Bruce took the stand, he said that he just wanted his sons to, quote, understand the hurt that they caused, end quote, and that he told his sons that, quote, The blows that hurt drive off the evil, end quote. But he never meant death. The worst part is, nobody once suggested that it was too much or that they should stop, despite Lucas begging for them to stop. Nobody got bandages or administered first aid. It wasn't until the next morning when Lucas stopped breathing that someone decided to take him to the hospital. And even then, it took Bruce a while to make that decision. A doctor would say that Lucas was probably dead for 1 to 2 hours before being brought to the hospital. This doctor also said that if Lucas had got medical attention, he probably would have lived. Sarah Ferguson was sentenced to serve up to 25 years for first-degree manslaughter. Bruce Leonard was sentenced to serve up to 10 years after a plea bargain to plead guilty to first-degree assault. Deborah Leonard was sentenced to 5 years for second-degree assault, but only served 3 years, and she's been since released. Tiffany Irwin was to serve up to 12 years after pleading guilty to first-degree manslaughter. Joseph Irwin, Tiffany's brother, is to serve up to 8 years for pleading guilty to first-degree assault and first-degree gang assault. Daniel Irwin was to serve 2 years in county jail for pleading guilty to 2 counts of unlawful imprisonment. Tracy Irwin was to serve 2 years in county jail for 2 counts of unlawful imprisonment. Dave Morey was sentenced to serve up to 5 years for pleading guilty on 2 counts of second-degree assault. Linda Morey was sentenced to serve up to 5 years for pleading guilty of 2 counts of second-degree assault. The church closed temporarily during the investigation and would reopen, but only for about a year. Eventually, everyone would leave the church and vacate the building. Christopher, I'm sure, still has a lot of things to deal with on a daily basis. It must feel like such betrayal that your own parents would murder your brother in the name of a cult. Bruce has apparently come to terms that he was in a cult and was very remorseful and misses his son every day. Debbie has since been released after serving only 3 years in prison, but I hear that she's had a little bit of a harder time coming to terms. In 2019, Tracy Irwin sold the building for $125,000 to CEM Realty, and then in January of 2021, the building that housed the church was for sale again for $389,000 and is available to be rezoned. I believe it's still for sale. My thoughts? First, if you want to know more detail about everything, read the book Without a Prayer, The Death of Lucas Leonard and How One Church Became a Cult. I will also put a link to Luke's older sister's blog, which is still active and will give you more insight on how manipulative cults can be. This whole situation is really just the saddest thing. The mind control of cults is astonishing. This wasn't the first time death has occurred within a cult, but something about this situation is so upsetting. What do you think? Leave me a comment if you have anything to add, or if you've had a cult in your area or have even attended a cult. I would love to hear about it. Thanks again for joining me here on Felony Spectator, and please hit subscribe if you haven't already so you never miss another episode. We'll see you next week.